Good morning and welcome to the thought for the day. I hope you're well. We're going to be looking at Rachel and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 29 through to chapter 35. And we can read about a love story filled with deception and lies, family conflict, sibling rivalry, insecurity, jealousy, discontent, but God working to bring about his will. So what do we know about Rachel? Well, the Bible tells us that she was the youngest daughter of Laban and sister to Leah. She was a shepherdess who would become the second but most favoured wife of Jacob and the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. Chapter 29 verse 10 is where we read about Jacob meeting Rachel for the first time, and the Bible tells us that he wept out loud and he kissed her. Such was his love for her, he wanted to marry her, and it was agreed that Jacob would work for 7 years for Laban, her father, for her hand in marriage. Now after the 7 years were up, came the wedding, but what we see is great deception by Laban as he gives Leah to Jacob on his wedding night and not Rachel, something that was undiscovered until the next day. However, we read on that Jacob agreed to work a further 7 years as payment for his marriage then to Rachel. Now we read that Rachel was unable to conceive a child with Jacob, but that Leah was blessed with many sons by God. And the Bible tells us that God was compassionate because he knew the rejection that she felt by Jacob as his least favoured wife. This obviously created a tension and jealousy within Rachel and resentment towards her sister. Rachel had Jacob's love and devotion and affection, but she wasn't satisfied and she wanted what her sister Leah had. In Genesis 30 verse 1, Rachel demanded of Jacob a child or she would die. Now what we see next is Rachel taking matters into her own hands, and it's worth pausing here to ask ourselves, is this something we do when we think God hasn't answered our prayers the way we think he should have? Have we felt like God has forgotten us, like we need to act rather than to wait on him? Rachel did, and she gave Jacob to her servant who bore two children for her. However, when we read on to chapter 30 verse 22, we're told that God remembered Rachel and he listened to her and he opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach, and she called his name Joseph. Not content with one son, Rachel wanted another child, and God blessed her and she conceived another son who would be called Benjamin by Jacob, as we read sadly that Rachel died whilst giving birth to Benjamin. Now, as I've read these passages on Rachel, I've been reminded of a number of things, and I just wanted to share them. Firstly, that God is in control. He is sovereign over all things, and we can trust in his timing. We often want answers fast and to know how the story's going to end, but we have to trust in God and his timing and know that, we've got a God with a plan who is working for our good, even when we face difficulties and setbacks and pain and discouragement that everyone will face at one time or another. We can see how Rachel thought God wasn't answering her prayers and took matters into her own hands. Even her husband Jacob reminded her that this wasn't in his control. He wasn't God. Waiting on God's timing isn't always easy, and it requires patience and perseverance and also letting go and submitting to God. With his help and strength, it is possible, and we can use this time to walk more closely with him and deepen our faith whilst we seek his will for our life. Another thing struck me, and that is how we're told that God heard Leah and he heard Rachel and knew their hearts, and God knew how rejected Leah felt, and he showed a compassion in blessing her with a family. And later on we read how God heard Rachel too and knew her longing for children. God showed his mercy and grace here by giving her Joseph and conceiving Benjamin. I think this demonstrates that God doesn't overlook anyone. People may overlook us, but God does not. He accepts us and he's there for us, and we can rest in this truth today. Lastly, through this story we can see how, despite what looked like a real mess, humanly speaking, that God was working. And when we consider Joseph and the man of God he became, and the significance of his life and the lives of his brothers, we see that through the sin and the consequences of sin, God worked to bring about his will. I think we should be encouraged today that we have a God who is merciful, who is gracious, who accepts us, has a plan for our lives, won't harm us, and we can rest in this truth today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a really good day.